All right, how's it going, everyone? Welcome. Elvira Gonzalez here. What I want to do in this 55 minutes is to make a very quick overview of what I have learned so far in the case of React, who made this particular course, and finally dive into the Model 3, which is exploring about how now this concept known as hooks allow us to developers to add behaviors to React applications. Why React? Because at the end of the day, it's quite convenient on how you can build this kind of user interface and fetching data from the server. So the whole point of this course, right, which is taught by Josh Gomez, I don't receive nothing at all. But I find that out that this is very, very useful in terms of understand how things work and how do we get here. Why? Because most of the time when you don't take my word for granted, take a look at when you, for example, you were 4 or 5 years old, or if you have some niece that are younger, right? So 4 or 5 years old, or even if you don't have it. So when you look at a child, and when trying to understand the world that is around it, is by also first looking at the human, their mouth, their face, and also listen to the story to see if that actually makes sense. Because initially, the authority of those story is our parents. Then, as you evolve and grow, and perhaps you stick your middle finger that hangers in between your legs in some of those girls you see out there, you started to realize the truth of affairs, which is exactly what I want to do in today's video, but with the React applications, and why it is convenient at least to write applications, and also that currently at the state of JavaScript, we don't need to go with all of these frameworks, because most of them, what they have done is to leverage the huge amount of effort of all of this software engineering that make, for example, tools like React or Angular or Vue, these frameworks for modern web development, to make it easy to work with. So it all starts with Facebook when they have a particular issue on their UI. Okay, so because now this piece of UI holds a particular state of information, it turns out that that state of information, it is shared across different other UI elements. So back then in the Facebook example, they have one for the notifications, they also one for the message drawer, and they also have that for the chat app. So because any time that they want to make now a particular change or update and state in one of these user components, right, they have to do that in all other places. So it might be, for example, very cheap to do that if you know code base. But as you're starting to add more and more and more user interface that use a specific state, it makes sense to actually have a centralized place where all of this user interface actually can consume from React, and then when that particular state updates, now somehow there's a mechanism to update all of this user interface that make use of that state. And that's the whole premise of React applications. So because this idea was so powerful that it's not only allows developers to build web app, but also mobile web apps or mobile apps, but in the case of React Native, right? So now, in order to understand that, first I look at the model one, which is, yeah, how do we get here, and understanding a bit more of the, yeah, pretty much to understand that how now React actually works behind the scenes. So what happens when you call React and you create a user interface? You actually call a JavaScript functions that is behind the scenes is creating now a JSON that describes that user interface. And user interface are HTML elements or any user-defined elements. So because this process is quite tedious, manual, so there's a bunch of folks that say, hey, let's going to now make our life easy to describe this user interface in this HTML plus JavaScript syntax known as the GSX. So when you combine now the GSX, which is now part of a build step required to generate now the code that actually is relevant for the browser to understand that, right? Which is with the React library. So now the entire web development changed dramatically because you have now is not only a build phase, but also is a new way to develop web applications. And this is what this particular model actually describes. To understand what GSX, what is the difference between HTML, GSX, for example, in terms of the HTML tags, some specific attributes, events, how you define those events, the white space, right? And a couple exercises and how you compare that with template engine. So far so good, because as I mentioned before, this new way of developing web applications in this component way, when you start from the small, and in this case the atoms, which is the HTML elements, or your own custom HTML elements, whether it is an input. So I'm just to mention, it's a common one, right? Whether it is a div or a section or a header, a paragraph, a footer, a navbar, and also some inputs, so input text, email, password, a text area, select, input radio button, input checkboxes, and as you describing this basic user UIs, you do that using now is a function to describe that. So that's exactly what we look at, right? So how you can define those functions, what props and children props actually works, what now how the application would look like. You have now the entry point of your application is the index.h, the index, yes, or tx TypeScript. So you have your entry point, which is the index that describes things like, hey, this is where React is going to mount our application on the HTML document. And you have now CSS stuff, for example, like loading your loading the look and feel of your app. So that's great. And also you have now the entry point of your React application, known as the app.gsx, right? Here's when you define things that are relevant for your React app, whether it is basic components, or the routing, or the themes, or some of the authentications, or some libraries for the error tracking. When something goes wrong, you want to actually know what happened. All right. You also want to do is sometime traveling, or wrap this into a state and define that state globally and keep track of that for debugging purpose. But again, this is just the main entry point, right? And also, then you also have is the uh, uh, the ESM modules or these JavaScript files that allow us to describe is the UI. That's the whole point of it. So with this in mind, which is part of the application structure, and when I look at what are the common things that we do when we build this kind of user interface, all right? So for example, it's like, hey, fragments allow us is to not need to pollute the entire global or to reuse or to use some of these HTML inputs, right? So for example, if you want to define all of the content inside of another content, so instead of actually defining is a div, for that you just, well, use a fragment to wrap all of these sibling elements. Okay, so that's what fragment is. It's also performance. But again, this is most of the time the things that we do in our as our job, right? In the front end development, it's like, hey, we need to create is a list of elements, iterations, and since we are now using is JavaScript to leverage how to do that instead of creating our own templated language, which is a good thing in my opinion. Then another common thing that we do is to conditionally rendering elements here, right? So whether it's using an if statement or an ampersand, which is for things like so it acts like a single if, right? Hey, I want to show this or this or this, or you can use this ternary operator to that act like an if-else statement, all right? And then you have now, this is part of the conditional rendering and all of the different cases that I mentioned. You also can use now is some show and hiding, right? Via the CSS by explicitly removing that element to the DOM, again via CSS, and some utility, for example, that are very useful for rendering that, right? Exactly. That are very, very useful to rendering that. All right. Now I understand. So now I understand what we have is this range utility thing, because hey, since this is a common thing that we're gonna do, good for us to have now this function that allows to, well, render elements as we need it. However, JavaScript with the array built-in objects, it allows us to define actually those kind of list of those kind of, it allows to rendering list of elements, right? So whether if you go with this range utility, which is leveraging the functional programming, right, or and you also look at the array prototype and combine with the conditional rendering and how actually makes sense. The other common things that we do here when developing this user interface is to provide now style in our applications, which is in the case of React is, well, how do you actually use CSS in React? For example, via the CSS models. So far so good, because this is just the basics. Then when you actually dive deep into building now applications, complex applications, when it requires interactivity by the users, this is when we need to look at how you can capture events from the users. And in order to do so, we need to first understand how you do that in plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So whether it is you use now an event listener to bind that element, and anytime that you listen for an event, and by element I mean it's a HTML element, right? You bind that, so you want to bind that element, and as long as that element that provide is a series of events that it can, when that happens, run the function. Okay. So this is one way of how you can actually is capture events, right? And the other is by explicitly now put that event listener or use as an attribute. Whether you capture events via the JavaScript add event listener, or by defining the events and the element attributes, right? The way of how now React works is by actually calling those functions for you. In other words, in HTML and CSS and JavaScript, you are, when you're using an event listener, you're passing now a reference, or you are defining as the function that needs to be called, right? And for the attribute definitions, you now call that function. So because we are not directly calling our function, it's React that is calling that. How so? Because we're passing as a reference to that HTML element that ends up being a React wrapper, right? So what's happening here is that this kind of components, or this is the way how React now actually detects an event, and it is not up to you to decide when to call this function. You just pass now this function to React, so it's up to React to call that function when that event happens. This kind of indirection is something that we're gonna see a lot in our applications, a lot of in the software industry, which is, this is not part of my own words, this is the words of a tremendous software engineer right now. He's chief scientist, fellow chief scientist at IBM. Oh my God, I have his face, but I don't remember his name right now. No, it'll come. But he mentioned that the entire history of software engineering is rising one level of abstraction. So so what does it mean is that most of the time we as users or even developers, there is a lot of layers that allow us to do things, that allow us to create applications that drive us in this economic incentive. So right now, most of us, we don't have to deal with the BIOS. And even though BIOS is something that we don't, or few developers actually know what is that. Not to mention what is uefi, which is again another part of the layer, and what this level of abstraction is doing. So for example, in the case of the hardware, right? So anytime that you power on your computers, there is a sequence of steps that actually happens. And I'm gonna be very brief here, but the idea is to describe that most of the time we don't care about those layers of abstractions, or perhaps we consciously don't need to remember those kind of layer of abstractions. But what we do need to know is that those layers exist. All right. So as an exercise, so anytime that you power on your device, right? For example, a CPU or a Mac. So it's gonna power up now a particular chip, which is known as the firmware. That this contains is a set of instructions permanently stored in this hardware that runs some hardware checks and run analysis, diagnostics, some hardwares, provide you now like a pre-OS environment where you can now boot a system, an OS, and when you do that, it will pass control to that booting store in a device. Those devices can be a USB stick. You're booting a computer from scratch, or it can be an SD card, or also a hard drive or a solid state drive, right? So this is something that most of the time we don't care about, you know, but that actually something that exists, because when that process happens, now the OS is now taking control, or in other words, the kernel, this software that now runs, initially is stored on disk, and then is mounted on the memory and take control of all of the other devices, right? So once that is done, you can see now is, hey, that you can open up your browser, you can open up Facebook, I don't know what with Facebook, but in Twitter, Twitter, now x.com, and so on and so forth, right? So this is to describe is the process of what happened when you power on the device. Most of the time, you don't need to recall this, but it's important for us to actually remember that things work. And why am I mentioning this? Because this is exactly what, when you are developing applications, UI, web UI, this is part of the nature of this, right? It's raising one level of abstraction and so on, right? So speaking of this raising of level of abstraction, is that how now React handles those events for us. And we need to pass these functions to do what we need to do at that moment. So when you need to provide some interactivity to the users, React come up with several hooks or behaviors. The most common one is React hooks. So, or the useState. This functions allows us to store some piece of information permanently, as long as the user doesn't leave our application or doesn't leave our site, right? And it works by using our closures behind the scene and so on and so forth. But what's happening is that any time that you have now this piece of information stored here, and you need to update that based on a user event, okay, you now is call that using inside of an event handler, makes sense, and update that state. So this is known as the core loop in React. So what happened is that this particular behavior or tool that React gave us to store a piece of information, so anytime that we update it by setting up that, it will kick off now this core loop, which say, hey, it has two scenarios. The first is when I am currently running, is this is initial this is on the initial page, or is this once the application is loaded and I am re-rendering? So if this is the first time, so React is going to now create all of these elements, appending those elements. Literally, you can take a look at the docs and say it's going to append all of these elements using the append document method to append all of this, right, into the DOM, and then you can see the UI. So, but once the app is mounted, so it turns out that it's gonna first detect which component triggered that state update. It's going to call that component that triggered that state updates, right? And if that component contains more React components, aka more React create elements function, right? Now it's gonna continue to call this, and any time that it calls that, if you remember from the beginning, it create now this JSON, which describe is the UI at that particular level. So the more element it needs to call, the more JSON it needs to generate, right? And once it knows, or once it goes through this, by creating now these virtual representations of the DOM, known as the virtual DOM, then it's going to now apply the bare minimum necessary DOM updates to the real DOM, okay? And then it's going to now, the browser detects those changes and pass through the critical rendering path, or in other words, it's going to reload that, and therefore you're going to see the UI match with the UI desired state. So this is part of the core React loop event that happens. Also, look at the difference between the rendering and painting, and why all the dance of this. And again, anytime that you are now updating your states, they are asynchronous, aka it will be happening in the next tick. It's not automatically, you know, it'll happen after the commit phase. So then I'll also look at the forms, okay, which is another thing that we do as UI developers. So fill forms here and there. Now this is form. How you can bind the data inside of the forms, how you can now submit a form, and all how you can use the submit form for that. How you can define is now forms in React. Also working with now complex states, understanding the props versus a state, right? How you can work with complex states, right? So the TLDR of this is that anytime that you need to update your state, create a new one, right? Especially if you're working with objects, right? Also, how this particularly works, this hook useState behave, when you pass a function, would you say, hey, this I wanted you to run this only when this component is mounted, period, no more, no less, right? And how you can now or how you have to explicitly tell to React to identify a list of elements that you are dynamically rendering using now, for example, crypto.getRender useId and that kind of stuff. So there is a concept also known as the lifting the state up, which say that anytime that you have a piece of information, you're gonna put that where it is relevant, right? And where that's relevant, where it's going to run this cascading effect, because from that point and on, all of those sequence elements will be re-rendered. So this is something that you might not want for all of those children React elements, which is one of the things that I'm going to look at in today's video of the memoization technique, all right? But I do find that very interesting that this actually happens. And the other notion is the components instance. So because now, anytime that you are now calling an element here in React, what it's doing is to say, hey, or anytime now React have to call these functions for you because you updating this state, right? It's creating now an instance of these components. In other words, these components now which live in memory. And this notion of components instance is just to develop an intuition between the rendering and the components instance, which is something that we're gonna see a lot of the time as we explore of the useEffect and how that things work. So that's great, that's good, because as we explore now with more and more complex applications, it is important also to know which kind of UI are we building. Are we building SaaS applications? Are we building small, simple web apps? Or are we building SaaS applications? Or perhaps we are building exactly, what kind of product are we building, right? It's a blog, it's a simple website with a lot of interactivity, or perhaps it's something like a game, right? When you need a lot of interactivity to that, or perhaps it's a or back office app, right? Or a SaaS. In these three baskets, so for the simple applications, you might have only one single state, single piece of information. For heavy client applications like games, right? You might need to have some sort of a state or global state, right? Or for any applications that actually have a lot of piece of information that need to keep track across the app, right? Whether it's real estate, for example, or the banking applications. I have extensive experience working on that. That's why and the other is the SaaS application, the back office application, where now the source of truth now live on the server. And this now open up is a new whole world of applications that are built, for example, in frameworks like Next.js, for example, right? So the whole point of this, okay, is just to describe that at the end of the day, as a developers, front-end developers or software engineers, we are building products. And there are some constraints of how large this product can be, physical constraints. What are the economic incentives that these applications might have, and also how hard or how large, how many people we need to have in order to build an application, right? So the size of the applications. So ideally, you don't want a developer to build an application. We have to be realistic. So, well, we need to have at least one. And then you started to see, so what are now the ways of how can we organize ourselves in order to build this kind of applications, organization. So, and I know that all of these go beyond the scope of React application, but it's quite important because this is all part of the software development. So in our case, what is relevant here, okay, what is relevant is that at the end of the day, we're getting hired to build an application. Hey, can you help me to build this user interface? All right, can you help me build this product? All right, so knowing the front end, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or TypeScript, right? And right now is with React, is helping a lot of solo developers, or even now companies, to lean or to flatten their structures, to be much more efficient of developing this kind of application. So, and speaking of that, when you're building now these SaaS applications, so there are now several questions that arise. One of them is that how you can make your request doesn't grow stale, how you can make your requests don't hammer in the API unnecessary, how do you catch the response of that request, how do you paginate that, and how you can now preemptively cancel a request once it fly away, right? So all of these set of questions now are addressed by, all right? So all of these kind of questions now are addressed So all of these kind of questions now addressing is for there is now a library that address all of these things, and also a team behind that. So for example, like Vercel, where they develop this Next.js application, which say, hey, let's gonna make our life much more simple when it comes to build this particular application. So our clients right now is those who want to build apps for us with this, let's say SaaS applications or whatever it is. That'll be very convenient, at least to understand this kind of challenge. So in terms of that, when you are developing this user interface, you also need to provide some behaviors, because we the only thing that we have back in React 17 16 is just components, where to organizing all of the UI. So some of those components are just for defining the UI, others for defining some piece of information or logic or business. This is why you have now this cascading effect of these nested components. So the React teams locally come up and say, hey, you know what? It'll make much more sense to anytime that you need to define is a app level behavior, use now a hook, particularly a custom. But these hooks, at the end of the day, what they offer us just behaviors. For example, you have now the useId or the useRef, but what this doing is providing behaviors. React give us to us is that, hey, anytime that you need some global identifiers, for example, that you need to put that on your form, right? And you might have several forms, as I mentioned before, which is the most common thing that you, as a UI developer, you're gonna do, is to build forms, right? The more you can do that, or the more forms you have in a product, somehow you need to have this unique identifier across all of these different forms. Some global identifiers. So for example, that's why we have the useId. So behind the scenes, what it's doing is just to generate is a unique identifier across our entire React app. Okay, makes sense. So you can use this, for example, in the HTML lab, HTML form, or for the IDs in your labels and input, right? Or even to group now a bunch of radio buttons or checkboxes. Okay, you say, hey, this set of radio buttons belongs to the same group by putting all of them in the same name, right? The same for checkboxes, but this work only is for radio buttons to group, to select at least one of those options. And that's quite interesting, because if you go, for example, to CodePen here, you know, some basic CodePen here, start coding here, you say, hey, please give me now exactly, give me now an input. All right, give me now an input where I want to define is the name. Say, hey, this will be radio, right? The type of this input is now a radio, a radio, radio, yeah, right. Then I also want to add a, for the sake of simplicity, I just want to put now a label on top of that. Now, label on top of that. Okay, and say, well, nope. The label is something that you can pass to this, right? And say, hey, the for, it'll be now to name. I want to sync that with the name, right? And if I say, hey, yes, right? So when so if I click here, sorry, I need to bind that to the ID. Say, hey, bind this label to this input. So now you can see these basic behaviors, all right? And if you're starting to say, hey, what if I want to have now multiple? Say, no, right? And I want to wrap them into a div because I want to put one after the another. This. Right. Because I want to put now one after the another. And because they're going to have is the same name, you either select one or the another one. Sorry, this must be is unique identifier. Yes, will be yes, right? And this will be no, and this will be no, right? Now when you click here, you select either one of them. So what this attribute is saying is that, hey, I belong to the same group, right? And that's pretty interesting behavior, right? So the browser now is handling that behavior for us. So why am I mentioning this? Because when I go back to these particularly behaviors like useId or useRef, which allow you to now is grab an element, grab an HTML element, and do things like focus the element when this component is mounted, or to draw some canvas on that, so on and so forth. This is behaviors that you can use that React gave us to us, right? So if you can imagine, well, you might have is a form with several options, right? And then you say, okay, how can I make these things much more easy to maintain? That's the whole point of that, right? So that's good because once I look at these most common hooks, there is a rule to use these behaviors, and that is always make your hooks, so put your hooks on the top of your components and don't wrap them in any logic here, right? In any condition statements or so on and so forth. So you can take a look at the docs as well. So once I look at that, there's also another concept here, immutability revisited, and the ref as well. Finally, we look at the behaviors that is the most well misunderstood in React, and that is the effects. So with the effect, the idea is that anytime you need to run a piece of function after the components renders to synchronize these components from external sources, right? For example, some global events from data from or data that come from the local storage, or yeah, data from local storage, or data that come from a server as well. Timers is another one. So anytime that you need to synchronize with these external systems, right? You use now a useEffect for that. So useEffect has now particularly anatomy, which is, hey, you're gonna pass now a function known as the yeah, you are gonna receive is a function that I'm gonna call for you when the core loop renders ends or after every renders. Okay, so this is known as the useEffect hooks, right? It also have now a particularly life cycle, which is, hey, the first parameter I'm gonna receive your function that I call, and then the second parameter is when I'm gonna call this function, which is, if I don't pass anything, it means that I'm gonna call this function after every render. If I pass an empty array after if I call that, I'm gonna pass that after Jesus. If I pass an empty array, I'm gonna call this after after the initial component is mounted, so only once. Or if you pass me now a dependency when each one of them. So this particularly behavior, which is something that we also look now at the memorization techniques like use callback and memo. This is the reason why development notions or intuitions of the components instance versus the rendering and the immutability is something that is going to develop, it's something that is going to helpful for us. Okay. So far so good, right? So we also look at a couple of exercises here or there. What actually happens when you pass now a function to the useEffects, and when you want to run now a cleanup function, all right? And how now those stales can grow stale when you don't update the proper state, or when those updates are not detected, all right? Which is the same thing as state setter callbacks here, part of this common theme here. And I would like to take a look at this stale values. So when I first started using computers in the late 90s, I used two different media players for live streaming. I have Real Player, and Real Player was okay, but it didn't really have any personality. To my teenage self, there was a much colored option available called Winamp. I don't know where Winamp actually, does Winamp still exist? Holy French does. Holy moly. Holy moly. That's interesting. Holy moly, bro. You know, this simple page, I mean, is exactly React. Yeah. Frame side, React, and so on and so forth. Okay, so far so good, right? Because, yeah, holy moly. So yeah, that's Winamp. Between those early days and now, there has been countless media players, but there is something they have all in common. Every media player I've ever used has implemented the exact same keyboard shortcut. The space keybar will play or pause the current selected song. Early in this model, we built a simple media player, and I think we should update it to include the spacebar shortcut. If you like, I encourage you to spend a couple of minutes attempting this problem, but I warn you, it is surprisingly tricky. So all of this is just to describe this behavior. So what happens when you're building out a player and you somehow want to now pause or play based on the spacebar? When the user hit the spacebar, you wanna, right? So how you can now try to replicate this kind of behavior, because at the end of the day, this is an event that lives outside of our React application, but it lives on the browser. So what we can do is to listen for that global event, check for that event to see if that event has been triggered by the browser, by the user. In our case, hey, the you trigger now is the space bar, and if it is, all right, so let me now update the state for. But it turns out that whether it's you update the state by even or defining as the state here, or by whether it's by updating the state here, for example here, right? This actually doesn't work. And as you can see, so when I play that again, exactly. Exactly. So what happened here is that you crash your app. What happened here is that you crash your app, right? So one way to solve that is to say, hey, or do I define that now, particularly piece of information in one place, where I say now here is when I'm going to develop. It is when I updating that state, right? Which is part of our solution here. So we don't make use of any. That's interesting. So we don't make use of any reactive dependency or any of this dependency on array here, as you can see here. What we use now is the components instance, is the access to these components, which is via this, right? So this is now getting into the weeds with React, particularly, right? But at the end of the day is to understand again the intention of the author of this tool, what they have learned from more than 50 years of software development, functional programming and object programming, right? So we don't skip that over, and yeah. And yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now the object, the element that actually, when you look at this, is actually work, right? I think you can hear that pretty well. I hope so. But the point of this is to there is a particular pattern now on using these hooks that allow us is to or using this state setter callbacks, all right, as brilliantly the author of this course described. There's a particular pattern here that is this, all right. There's a particular pattern when using this tool provided by React, when you have now this callback that you can define, or this array of dependency, and that is that you can now is define your event handlers, all right. You can define your event. You will define is a particular effect. Again, this is another thing here, is that you define your effect per synchronization process, per behavior here. Per behavior here. Exactly. This is something. So this is useful because React provides the current value of this, right? You get this. So when to use the callback syntax? The callback syntax. The stale values are restricted to useEffect theme. We can also run into this sort of issue when using useMemo or useCallback. Discuss later in this model, and also when doing asynchronous work, fetching data. Discuss in the next model. Occasionally, it can be more convenient to use the callback syntax. For example, if we are passing the state setter function as a prop to a children component, to a child component, we can use the callback syntax to modify the current value without also having to pass the value through the props. And now the custom hooks. So custom hooks is now allows to define app level behaviors in our applications, right? Okay. So yeah, I'm gonna leave that for now. That'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.